Hello and welcome to Decks Done Right TCG. Here we are with a requested deck tech. This is my Enchantress deck that I built. It's pretty standard for the most part, but I have made some adjustments. That's why I didn't really think that you guys would want it on camera, but I went ahead and did it anyways by request. If you guys want some of my other decks, I will put them on as well. So let's go ahead and get into this deck tech. We're going to start off with the creatures. We got starting off is Arbor Elf, and he's pretty simple, just 1 mana, 1/1, untapped target forest. Well, that is pretty big whenever you have a Utopia Sprawl enchanting that forest, because now that forest can tap for 2 mana, and whenever you tap it for 2 and then untap it and then tap it for another 2, that's 4 mana. And you could do that as soon as turn 2. So a very strong card here. Matches very well with the Utopia Sprawl. Typically, depending on your hand, because this deck is so heavily in the white, you're going to name white with Utopia Sprawl, but there might be the occasion where you have an Eidolon in your hand and you don't have another green source on board, so you know, you may have to go ahead and do that. But yeah, so we got here, the next up is Herald of the Pantheon. It's a 2 mana 2/2, 1 green, 1 colorless. And it is a Centaur Shaman. It says enchantment spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Then it says whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you gain 1 life. So this is kind of like one of the enablers to the deck. It allows you to play all your spells cheaper, and you gain life off of them, basically. The only enchantment spells in the deck are the Arbor Elves themselves, the Kruphixes of Insight, and what's in the board. So almost everything else is enchantments. So you're going to gain a life and it's getting a cost reduction. So very strong card. Though you don't necessarily need them in multiples, but it is a nice thing to have on board. Next up is Courser of Kruphix. Another card that potentially we could go down to 2 on and bump up another something or other in the deck, but 3's pretty good just because it's a 2/4 for 3 mana. It's got that big butt and it cannot lie, and it's an enchantment creature Centaur. Basically it says you play with the top card of your library revealed. You may play the top card of your library if it's a land card. And then it says whenever a land enters a battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. Now, seeing what's on top of your deck helps with Eidolon of Blossoms to know whether or not to draw that card, or if it's a fetch, you can fetch it away so that way you draw something else. So this is actually a really good effect to have, to know what you're going to be drawing into. Granted, your opponent gets to see what you're drawing into, but sometimes them seeing they're inevitably losing is totally fine, and they'll extend the hand. So lastly, the part about you gaining life, so having multiple in play, you definitely gain the life, but it's not the other card that you can play lands off the top of your deck, because you can't play an additional land. You can only just play still your 1 land a turn. I'm blanking on that card right now. It's from World Week block, I'm sure. But yeah, similar effect, but not as good as that card. But this is a good in this deck because it's an enchantment, so it procs off your other stuff. Next up is Eidolon of Blossoms. This is the whole reason why you're playing this deck, is for this card right here. It says Eidolon of Blossoms is 4 mana 2/2, 2 green, 2 colorless, enchantment creature spirit. Whenever Eidolon of Blossoms or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So it itself draws a card, and any copy after that, you also draw another card. So, like, if you have 2 of them out and you play any enchantment, you draw 2 cards. And at some point, it can get pretty silly, especially whenever you reduce the cost of them. Then you're paying like a 1 mana Journey to Nowhere or 1 mana Blind Obedience, and you're just paying 1 mana to draw 2 cards, or even just 1 mana to draw a card because you only have the one in play. It's really good. This is the whole reason to play the deck, is this specific card, and definitely don't leave home without it. Never board it out either. I made the mistake of that once, never again. This card stays in the deck the whole time. Next up is one of the only non-creature, non-enchantment spells in the deck. And it is, I'm sorry, there's also in the board, but this particular card in the main board. So it's Kruphix's Insight, 3 mana, 2 colorless, 1 green. It says reveal the top card of your reveal the top 6 cards of your library. Put up to 3 enchantment cards from among them into your hand, and the rest of the revealed cards into your graveyard. So, because the majority of your deck is enchantments, you're gonna hit 3 on average, actually. There's only been, like, with me playing, I think I've not hit at least 3, like 4 times ever. And I've been playing this deck for a while, so it procs pretty often. There is a possible replacement that I was considering before I landed on this, which is Intellect Tutor, which allows you to search for any card. But the fact that you get 3 enchantments is pretty crazy, because a lot of times you're trying to end the game, or to find the cards that you need. You're just trying to dig for them to close the game out. So having multiples of cards allows you to draw more cards, which is what you want to do. So if you replace this with Intellect Tutor, sure, you can go get your finisher, but with Eidolon of Blossoms, you're essentially getting 3 cards that are going to draw you more cards. So I think this is a pretty efficient spell, and a lot of times will find you what you need still, without having to tutor for it, which is awesome. Next up is Utopia Sprawl. I kind of already glossed over it a little bit, but works well with Arbor Elf. You enchant specifically a forest, so it has to be a forest. And then whenever it comes into play, you choose a color, and then it says whenever enchanted forest is tapped for mana, its controller adds 1 mana of the chosen color to his or her mana pool. So this gets enchanted on the Temple Garden or the Canopy Vista or the snow-covered forest, and there's no reason that they're snow-covered. I just didn't have any more basics, similar with the plains. But you just enchant it and then go to town making a bunch of mana. And therefore you can get your Eidolon of Blossoms out turn 2. So it's pretty sweet with these 2 together. They're buddies. Next up is Porphyry Nodes. And this is a odd enchantment, but it is very strong. Because a lot of the time when you're setting up early, you may not have any creatures on board. So this thing becomes a house. So for 1 mana, it says at the beginning of your upkeep, destroy the creature with the least power. It can't be regenerated. And then it says if 2 or more creatures are tied for less power, you choose one of them. And then it says when there are no creatures in play, sacrifice Porphyry Nodes. So one of the things that's pretty sweet about this card is it gets around Shroud and Hexproof. So it you're not targeting the opponent, you're not targeting so you're not targeting the player, because it actually could be your creatures, and you're not targeting the creature itself. So it actually gets around, Leila of Sanctity or any of that stuff. So this is actually a really good card. If you see that your opponent's playing like Goyf, whatever, blah, 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 and flooding the board and you don't have any dudes out yet, play a Porphyry Nodes, make them sack their dudes, and then once you basically cleared the board, then it goes away. But it does happen at that moment in time. So when there are actually no more creatures in play, let's say the Porphyry Node goes off and kills a creature and there's one left. And then during my turn, I journey to nowhere their last creature. Well, then Porphyry Nodes would immediately go away as soon as the creatures are gone. So next up is Authority of the Consuls. For 1 white mana, creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tap. And it says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, you gain 1 life. So a little bit of life gain, kind of like Courser and Herald of Pantheon, which is the bane of Burn's existence. They can't stand that. So the incremental life gain is awesome. Though Burn doesn't play a bunch of creatures, they do play a few, so you gaining that little bit is enough to warrant them getting aggravated. It's not like an all-star, but it's enough to slow your opponent down for you to establish the board control to prevent them from attacking you. So it's kind of like a stall tactic early on, so you can get to your late game and close the game out. Next up is Journey to Nowhere. It is a 2-mana enchantment, 1 white, 1 colorless. It says when Journey to Nowhere enters the battlefield, exile target creature. When Journey to Nowhere leaves the battlefield, return the exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control. Now, they just printed a new card in Dominaria that is probably going to replace this card, called Seal Away. I haven't quite evaluated how many creatures in Modern have Vigilance, because that is like why you would still play this over Seal Away, because even though Seal Away has Flash, it can only target, or it can only hit a tapped creature. So if there's, and I'm trying to go through my head, I haven't really sat down and thought about it, but if there's enough relevant creatures that have Vigilance, then we're going to stick with these. If not, we'll make the swap out and it'll be 2 for 2. We'll just put the 2 Sillaways in, take those 2 out. Next up is Greater Auramancy. And this is kind of like your Please Stop Touching My Stuff card. So for 2 mana, 1 white, 1 colorless enchantment. It says other enchantments you control have Shroud. And then it said enchanted creatures you control have Shroud. So basically, makes your whole deck hexproof or Shroud, except for these guys here. That's it. Everything else has Shroud. That's what it says. Except for itself. So if you're playing against a deck that has spot removal like Ancient Grudge, well, it wouldn't hit enchantment, but something, Qasali Primage, for instance. It would have to target it before it could do anything else. So unfortunately, even if they want to target one of your Ghostly Prisons or whatever, they would have to target this first and then hopefully recur back the Qasali Primage to get rid of the other enchantments. Next up is Blind Obedience. It's an okay card, similar to that of Authority of the Consuls. It's for 2 mana, 1 white, 1 colorless enchantment. It says it's got Extort on it, which means you can pay a white, and whenever you cast a spell, your opponent loses a life and you gain a life. And then it says artifacts and creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. So it's very similar to this one, but you gain life off of the spells you cast. So that's why it's in there. A little bit more incremental life gain. Plus, you never underestimate the fact that like you pay 2 mana, draw a card. Like that's pretty sweet. Or if Herald's on the battlefield, you pay 1 mana, draw a card. Like, that's really sweet. Next up is Ghostly Prison, and this is probably the second reason to play the deck, I guess is the way to put it, because it basically board stalls out your opponent. They have to pay, well, I'll say Ghostly Prison is 3 mana, 1 white, 2 colorless. It says creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 colorless for each creature he or she controls that's attacking you. So there are some cards that technically get around this. For instance, like Hero of Bladehold, if you can tap 2 mana and attack with it, the creatures that come into play tapped and attacking, they get around this card. The Hero of Bladehold didn't, but if the player was able to pay the 2 for Hero of Bladehold, then the creatures would come into play tapped and attacking. That gets around the Ghostly Prison. So there are a very narrow amount of cards that actually get around it, but for the most part, this just glums up the opponent's board and they can't really do anything with them. And so next up is Oblivion Ring, and this is the catch-all for the deck for a white and 2 colorless. It says whenever Oblivion Ring comes into play, remove another target non-land permanent from the game. It says when Oblivion Ring leaves, play return the removed card to play under its owner's control. So this is basically to get rid of planeswalkers or random other enchantments or artifacts that are problematic. This will help you get rid of those things. So think like if you're playing against Affinity, you want to get rid of the cranial plating. Similarly, if you're playing against a control deck, you can get rid of planeswalkers, or Jund, you can get rid of Liliana. So more times than not, it's going to be, this is used to get rid of planeswalkers, or, I mean, you could still use it to get rid of creatures, but this one's obviously more efficient for doing so. So if you had both in hand, you'd play the Journey. But you hold this for the big threat that you are coming up against. Next up is a very solid card. I totally forgot that this card existed, but it is awesome. So it's Story Circle for 3 mana, 2 white and 1 colorless. It says, as Story Circle comes into play, choose a color. And then you pay 1 white, and then the next time a source of the choice of the chosen color would deal damage to you this turn, prevent that damage. So it is awesome. It gets around not being able to be targeted. So hexproof creatures and shrouded creatures, this still gets around that because you're not targeting it. You're just choosing something. Any monocolored decks like red, green, blue, basically any monocolored deck, this pretty much hoses. Red, it really hates on red because you could just, pay a white and blank that lightning bolt, or pay a white and get rid of, remove the damage from Eidolon. Like, it's just so awesome. Though there isn't a ton of monocolored decks, so there's only 1 in the main and 2 in the side. But if there was just a plethora of monocolored decks, then I would definitely bump this up to a 2 of in the main. Next up is one of the finishers, is Helios, God of the Sun, for 4 mana, 3 colorless and 1 white, a legendary enchantment creature. So I do apologize. Technically, this is a creature, and I should have put it up here. But more times than not, it's mainly just a token generator. Honestly, It has indestructibility, and it says as long as your devotion to white is less than 5, Heliod isn't a creature. Then it says other creatures you control have vigilance, which basically all your creatures are real small, except for whenever Starfield of Nyx comes out, then some of these get bigger, but most of your guys are small. Even the guys it makes are small. So them having vigilance is not a big deal. But the sweetness of this card is that for 4 mana, 2 colorless, 2 white, put a 2/1 white cleric enchantment creature token onto the battlefield. So whenever you create this, it triggers Eidolon to draw a card. And that, like, basically you keep going, and at some point, even if you don't have her anymore, your Nykthos can tap for a bajillion mana, and then you just start pumping out tokens, and then you can just swarm the board at that point. You can just overwhelm your opponent with a bunch of tokens. But if you're trying to find a piece of whatever you're missing, you can use that to draw cards so you can find whatever you're missing. Next up is Ghostly Presence Big Brother, Sphere of Safety, for 5 mana, which is why it's a bigger brother, for 4 colorless and 1 white. It says creatures can't attack you or a planeswalker you control unless their controller pays X for each of those creatures, where X is the number of enchantments you control. And as you might tell, that might be 5, it might be 8, it might be 9 mana they would have to pay for 1 creature. And these stack. So if you have this out and this out, they would have to pay the 2 plus whatever this was, whatever X might be. So if you got 4 enchantments on the battlefield, it would be 4 plus the 2, which is 6. Pretty gross. Next up is one of the win cons of the deck. So much like this one pumps out tokens, this one also pumps out tokens. But this one requires you to cast an enchantment spell. So it's, Sigil of the Empty Throne for 5 mana, 3 colorless and 2 white. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, put a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying onto the battlefield. And the reason why this is the closer is because in Modern, there just really isn't that many flyers. Outside of a few decks, there really isn't that many flyers. And even the decks that run flyers is typically like Lingering Souls, and they're just 1/1s. So once you start flooding the board with 4/4s, you're just crushing your opponent, and that's how you end the game most of the time, is through this card. Next up is another closer, Starfield of Nyx, for 5 mana, 4 colorless and 1 white. It says, at the beginning of your upkeep, you may return target enchantment card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So if you try to dig with Kruphix's Insight and you accidentally, you were only able to pull 3, so there's 1 to 2 more in your graveyard. Now you can start pulling them back with Starfield of Nyx. Or let's say they targeted one of your other guys, your Eidolon or your Kruphix, Courser of Kruphix. Now you just bring them back each turn. Even though these creatures do turn on your opponent's spot removal, you can get them back with this guy. So then it says, as long as you control 5 or more enchantments, each other non-aura enchantment you control is a creature in addition to its other types and has a base power and base toughness, each equal to its converted mana costs. So basically your big guys turn on as creatures, and some of your smaller ones too, which you got to be careful about. That can be dangerous because this again turns on your opponent's spot removal. So you turn that into a creature, they path it, now you're really out there bad because now you can't recur it, and your protection that you had is could be gone. So you got to be careful on when you play this card. But if you've established a board presence and your ahead on board or whatever, then you can play that as a closer. But you gotta be careful that you don't just jam it when you have 5 mana. Next up is the lands, and there's nothing like too crazy here. We've got one Nykthos, which is a sweet card. We have no way to tutor for any of the lands outside of the fetches here. So you could essentially play another Nykthos, but it's not that. Obviously, it's not good in multiples, so you can't run both, or you don't want to run both, rather. But generally, you can tap, because there's a lot of white. You know, there's double white here, double white here. There's also double greens. So you can produce a lot of mana off of this. Next up is some dual lands here. We got some Temple Gardens, some Shocklands, some fast lands, and the Razorverge Thickets. The Battle Lands? I'm trying to remember which one of these ones are. If you have 2 or more basics, it comes into play untapped. Then we got the fetches and the basics, 4 of each. We also have 2 Field of Ruins here. And Field of Ruin has like become now like a really like big staple in modern control decks. And this is kind of what this is. This is a kind of like a mono white prison type deck a little bit, but this card goes in a lot of control decks because you can, you know, take out their dual lands and keep them off of a color or what have you, while still being able to have lands. So it doesn't hurt you. You're not going down a land like you would with Ghost Quarter. You're actually keeping parity with the lands that you already have. So that's why it's such a good card. And then lastly, we got the sideboard here. First card is Open the Vault for 6 mana, which sounds like a bajillion, and it is. But you can get there sometimes. 4 colors, 2 white. It says return all artifact and enchantment cards from all graveyards to the battlefield under their owner's control. Now, you got to be careful because maybe your opponent was playing something that's relevant that was an artifact or enchantment. But basically, this is to get you back into the game. Let's say they play Back to Nature and blow up your whole board, or Fracturing Gusts and blow up your whole board. This is a way to bring all that stuff back into play. And basically, like, if you have this and a bunch of other, you know, if you have an Eidolon and a couple of other enchantments that enter the battlefield all at the same time, like, it's going to trigger Eidolon to go off a bunch. It's going to be pretty sweet. So, this is a very swingy card. Next up is Rule Along. It says each player can't play more than 1 spell each turn. This is a housed against Storm. And other decks that try to gain value with quick spells like Snapcaster and stuff, prevents them from doing shenanigans of Bolt, Snap, Bolt. So very good card. While this deck does want to play sometimes 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 spells a turn, trying to dig, you can play this card so that way you can. It's better to stall out your opponent anyways. So. To slow them down, that way you can catch up and be in parity. Next up is Stony Silence, and then it says for 1 white, 1 colorless, and activated abilities of artifacts can't be activated. So this says Tron has a tough time. Affinity can go fly kites. Different stuff like that, but it's basically the artifact hoser. And as you can tell, we don't play any artifacts, so it doesn't hurt us at all. Next up is Leila of Sanctity. And this card is really important right now because there's so much hand disruption, but it's 4 mana, 2 white, 2 colorless. for an enchantment, it says, if Leyline of Sanctity is in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it in the begin the game with it on the battlefield. Sorry. Then it says you can't be the target of spells or abilities your opponents control. So you have hexproof. So if your opponent if you have this out and your opponent tries to Liliana make you sack a creature, you can't be targeted. Like I said, hand disruption is like at an all-time high right now. That's the reason why Boggles plays main deck Leyline of Sanctity, because that deck is so fragile that any kind of hand disruption kind of just hoses that whole deck's game plan. So this is a pretty good card. Next up is the other two story circles. And I kind of went over that card already, but if you are playing against a monocolor deck, you always still bring them in. Next up is Rest in Peace, and this is our Graveyard Hoser. Enchantment, it says whenever Rest in Peace enters the battlefield, exile all cards from all graveyards. And then if a card or token would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. Now granted, we are going to have some things that go to the graveyard, but like this is just a win more card. Like whenever you're able to recur a creature, or I'm sorry, enchantment each turn. But if you're facing down Dredge or Hollow One or whatever, like this is like you're just like, oh well, I don't have a graveyard now. So, but it's gonna help stop my opponent. So, lastly is Gideon's Intervention, and this is the other catch-all for Oblivion Ring, or the other catch-all like Oblivion Ring rather. So the deck originally ran Nevermore, but this is just a strict upgrade for 1 more mana, because it says for 4 mana, 2 colors, 2 white, as Gideon's Intervention enters the battlefield, choose a card name. Your opponent can't cast spells with the chosen name, which is what basically Nevermore said. But why this is better, it says prevent all damage that would be dealt to you and permanent you control by a source of the chosen name. So if they by chance were able to get the card out before you were able to play this card, you can still prevent damage from that card. So let's just say they were able to turn 1, go crazy and drop their life down total by a lot, and you didn't have not turn 1, but let's just say a couple turns, and you didn't have Oblivion Ring or Journey into Nowhere, but they play a Death Shadow. Well, now since the card's already on the field, with Nevermore, you would have just taken a bunch to the face, but now this prevents that damage. So, really strong card. And it's a good way to interact with combo decks. If they have a linchpin card, you essentially can name that card, and now they can't play that card. So yeah, this is an all-star right here. But yeah, this is Green White Enchantress. If you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below, and I will try to get those as soon as possible. But thanks for watching. You guys have a good day.